Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby. I was pretty close to the mic there. Let me get back. Okay. There's so much I want to say. And I said to myself, I'm going to keep this. I'm not going to do a 2-hour podcast or even an hour and a half. So I'm going to try to keep to that. Because I'm not really sure where to start here. I have come back to, although I never left, non-dual teaching. Actually, specifically, the first and second dimension. Publicly on YouTube for free. Which means basically everything that for the first 10 or 11 years of my teaching that I did videos for free, of course. But, I had books that you had to buy. There were programs where you had to learn second dimension inquiry. We didn't have third dimension back then. We charged for that. Sessions in which people would come and, and I helped them. Again, retreats, workshops, none of that. It's all free. First and second dimension on YouTube starting last Sunday. And it'll be every Sunday on my YouTube channel at 5 p.m. Pacific until I change that. And I might throw a few other things in there, but in order to know, if you want to go to my YouTube channel for just that, my non-dual teaching, go to the playlist, and it's the one called Free Non-Duality Teaching. Pretty easy. And now the question is why, but I'm going to explain why, but let me explain what that means actually. I think you guys will be interested in this story. For those of you who have been interested in self-realization, been reading books, and been on your own, I think this is for you. Two things, at least more than that, happened to shift me back into teaching in first and second dimension. Because I'm going to explain what I do here on podcast also. Don't worry, I hope to clarify that, and that's why I'm doing this podcast, this episode. Two things. One was a teacher who's out there right now, fairly popular, had a quote in which he was teaching, and then he said, well, I'm not really a teacher. But it wasn't necessarily, some people say it like, well, there's no teacher here. Or some people say, I'm not really a teacher. But it felt from the energy of the words that it was more like disowning something, coming from repression, veiled in non-dual language. And I was talking to Dan about it. And because just the confusion of that, where you've got, like I was, a teacher who is disowning the very thing he's doing in the world and might say it's in the name of freedom, but here's what I have to say about that. In non-dual realization, there are no independent things. There's no separate things. The self or the teacher isn't a special thing that's empty. It's just one of the things that's empty, at least in certain forms of Buddhism. Now, I'm telling you, different traditions say it differently. But the point is, I saw when I read that that's not where I want to go. And I knew it when I saw it, but I didn't know where it was going to lead me. I was talking to Dan about it, and he felt the same way, that it was like disowning something, which I hope to explain. But it's like saying, I'm doing something, but I'm not really that, as a way to stay safe and get love, because you're disowning something you're actually doing in the world. Now, and from non-dual realization, you could say, well, there is no teacher. Why wouldn't he say that? But that's where I want to bring in a couple of my teachers. And this is all the reason that I'm coming back to first and second dimension teaching for free, is to counterbalance these kinds of teachings. Because if you can have a trauma-based or a repression-informed non-duality, that even if you don't get into our repression work, on YouTube, I'm going to show you how you don't have to do that for now. And you just first and second dimension, which I'll explain. But I just realized I don't want to go down the road he's going down, because I know where it comes from. It comes from repression. When I was talking to Ken Wilber a few years ago, we were on the phone and I was asking him questions about integral spirituality, the stages of development, lines and stages of development that he talks about, states of consciousness, and bypassing shadows and non-duality teachers. We had a really lengthy, robust conversation, or at least I thought so. I really wanted to talk to him, and there we were. And I said, okay, Ken, I want to ask you this. What is it about we teachers? Because I had done it, and this was like years ago. I mean, this was like 2012. But I just caught on to myself saying things like there's no teacher or I'm not a teacher. And I knew that it was coming from something unprocessed, but I didn't have consciousness of my own anger repression at that point, like so many teachers. Like I think this teacher who was disowning that. And it's interesting now that I look back at that conversation, Ken did not say that's the emotional repression of that teacher. But, and I'll explain what he did say, which I thought was even more helpful. But later on in interviews, Ken's language, if you follow him, has gotten sharper with regard to the bypass. If you look at interviews as he's gotten older from like 2018 on, every time I pop one up, he's pointing pretty directly to the trauma and the emotional repression and shadows that get overlooked in Eastern practice and teachings. So his language has sharpened, and I know he was aware of emotional repression back in 2012. I wasn't. I mean, I'm assuming he was because shadows, which he talks about, come from repression. So I know he knows that, and he studied it, and I knew that, but he didn't bring it up in the conversation. And I don't know if he was just using like skillful means with me or something, but he said, well, it's like this, Scott. That would be like having to take an eraser around with you, no matter where you go, as a teacher or otherwise, to say, I'm having a drink of this coffee. Erase that. There's no coffee. And there's no I. I'm going to do a podcast. No, erase. There's no podcast. There's no I. Well, I'm not going to do a podcast then. Well, there's no podcast to not do. Erase. And there's no I to not do it. I didn't say it that way. He gave his own examples. And it just stopped me. I didn't have anything else to say. I mean, I didn't understand why I resonated with the answer, but now I know exactly. My God, that's deep wisdom. Ken, you should be sharing that publicly. Why? He probably did somewhere. I don't know. He's done a lot. Thank you, Ken, because that planted the seed in me. I was already doing shadow work per your suggestion, even back in 2012, which led me to the repression that so many people bypass in non-duality. And that question was just the perfect timing for me to know that even though you didn't really answer it directly in terms of, well, now I know what it was. See, when we disown things like erase concepts and I, that's because we're trying to annihilate ourselves. That's the repression that doesn't want to feel what we've buried. And so, you can't be the authority for your own experience with repression. You can't allow it all. And so not being the authority, to actually be an authority, a teacher, would not be possible for that nervous system. And so although it might look very non-dual to say, well, there's just no teacher here, it's all body, all of it. So whether there's a teacher there in experience has nothing to do with what a teacher says, because we say things to stay safe and get love. It's the score that's kept in the body. So if I was talking to Ken today, I would say, Ken, don't you agree that when non-dual teachers do that, that's a disowning, much like with shadow work coming from that teacher's repression? And if it isn't, that teacher ought to just be able to explain that to us, because if the teacher doesn't know those words or doesn't know that aspect of consciousness, then that's what that is. And this is not about that teacher. I could care less. What happened for me after reading that, and I just told you the story of me and Ken, that was years ago. But after reading this very recent thing, and this is when I wanted to come on YouTube, and for another reason, which I'll explain, and teach again. and not just do podcasts and inquiry privately. Basically, what I've done in the last 8 years is YouTube and podcasts that I'm just talking. I mean, if it's a teaching, it's a teaching. But when I say first and second dimension teaching, when I'm coming back, I'm doing it like a teacher does. I'm actually going to teach. And the other reason that I'm doing that is quite simply because I want to. I mean, that's the best way to sum that up. But it goes deeper than that. Let me explain it. Okay. For about 5 years, people have asked me, Scott, you don't point to awareness. You don't really do first or second dimension publicly. You've changed completely. And you don't do what you used to do. Why don't you go out and just do it? You can explain the bypass. And I didn't know why, because when I checked into my body, I didn't find any energy on it. Like I can't, or I can. So it didn't feel like it felt like a boundary, but I couldn't find the boundary. All I knew it was a no. And it wasn't a body no. You know how you get that with like, no, it's not that. It was like, no. But then when I tried to articulate it, I couldn't. Now I can. It's something very simple because I had to process some money stuff after that to see it, which is, it's the same reason that for a couple of months last year, I struggled to pay bills for a couple of months last year. And it's this reason I refused to charge for first and second dimension. So that had affected my income. And I refused to go back into first and second dimension to repair my income. I could have held retreats like other non-dual teachers do. I could have made money that way. And I just refused, but I didn't even have to articulate to myself. And it affected my income. So it was like a conscious demolition of something. I mean, I wanted that. I didn't want to do it the old way, and I certainly didn't want to charge. So once I processed that, and these other things happened, there were a few other things. I mean, stepping into this feels like the most natural and authentic thing in the right time. And it wasn't the right time up until just recently. And that's what living authentically is. You know, it's not about, oh, I can just go do what I want. It's about knowing when I am not. Not because I'm blocked, but because it's just not the right time. And I had to process some other things that weren't connected directly to that ended up opening that, I must admit. But that's a matter of waiting patiently, not by mind, but trusting experience. And just when you know, you know. And I know. It's time. And it's not a big deal. It's a big deal for me because I didn't understand really. It wasn't like it was unconscious. It was just like, it's a no to something, you know? You don't have to explain it. Have you ever had that before where you don't feel like you have to explain it? You kind of are curious as to why you're saying no, but you don't feel a compulsion to explain it. And that's because it was just a clear no. But now I can go back and I can do first and second dimension, which I'll explain here, and feel good about it because what I'm going to do is something that you could say, well, I should have done that before. People will say that, why didn't you just do that 5 years ago? Well, I just explained why. But because I didn't feel good about it. I didn't feel good about the bypass either. I mean, you know, I've been through a process of anger, guys, where I recognized that was the root of my suffering. And then, you know, so much of my suffering went away from the non-dual shift, but the pain and then the cancer, of course, remained. And I saw how much buried rage there was. And I saw the anger towards my own self and teaching and other teachers for doing that unconsciously, leading people into a regulated bypass, the nervous system regulated bypass, which isn't embodied, which would be fine if they took them all the way or pointed to the need for that, but then often that is shunned, the embodiment process, by some. Some. Not all. So I want to go back and teach, clearly, for the right reasons, I think. I mean, I don't think that, I know it. But that's for you to decide. I'm not the arbiter of all things. If you think it's off, it's off. Well, now that you know that and you know it's free, let me tell you what you're going to get actually. Because I'm not doing it for that reason. I had to check my body for that too. Because with repression, I've learned to check my body with everything that I say that's important in relationship, including as a teacher. And if I don't, there's some sort of deception or suffering connected to it. So I've learned to check. And I had to check, of course, because here I am giving away. You could say, well, it's free anyway, it's presence. But no, I mean, I've been teaching and pointing and developing inquiries in Second Dimension, which I'm going to share with you on YouTube, things that I used to charge for. And so I had to look and see, I'm not getting anything out of this, or I'm not doing this to get their love or approval. To see what came up. And it was nothing. And that's what I mean by trust, because before, if I would do things, well, there was a quiet no before to that whole thing. And so when there was a yes, I wanted to make sure that wasn't just some hidden repression. See, pushing me out to get your love and approval and stay safe from that repression, and then go back to first and second dimension bypassing. And that's not what it is. It's almost the opposite of that. I want to go out and do first dimension and second dimension the way that I think it should be done, with the bypass and all that information about repression brought into the context, but not focused on until we get to 3D. Although in 2 dimension, we'll start that, prepare for that. This is an awakening and embodiment path for those that are interested. And it starts now on YouTube, and I'm going to clearly delineate it, because I can see that social media is I feel my sat song, because we're in a different era. And to sit with people, I'd love to in person, but there's so much opportunity for YouTube, for me to do the first and second dimension stuff, and to educate you about the bypass and the root of suffering, which is third dimension, and to come back here on podcast. Because when I come back, you'll see, hopefully, and that you've seen, this podcast is the actual context from me around my work. So if you ever wonder, what is Scott's actual teaching, or what is his perspective, it's here. This is my most authentic. I've given you my life here. I've turned it inside out for you, and the teaching and I've given you everything but the skills here, and that's for you to get. But the YouTube is for everyone who may or may not have resonated with what I'm saying here on podcast, but you're just interested in first or second dimension teaching and practice. And this is for you. And I'm going to invite a lot of you back who left because I wasn't doing that too. And so the next segment, I'm just going to hopefully briefly explain the 3 dimensions so that I can go more into what exactly you'll get if you just come to YouTube. And remember, if something is free, it doesn't mean it doesn't have value. I'm about to give you a ton, probably more than most other teachers, and they charge for it, and it's free here. So don't undervalue it just because it's free, and just because you can click on your YouTube app any morning and there's the teaching or the satsang thing. All the information is there. Don't take that for granted, because that's what your system wants. See, if you come and sit with me, I'm going to tell you about the thing that's driving all of it. I'm going to show it to you. If you don't, you might go somewhere else where they're not going to tell you that, and they're going to point you into that bypass. So you have every right to go somewhere else, of course. But remember, just because it's free doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. I hope it does, but sometimes people just sort of don't value it if they don't pay for it. So let's see what happens. Stay tuned. I'm going to tell you about the 3 dimensions. I wanted to add that another one of my friends, who was more of a teacher for about 2 years, but we would call each other friends. When we talked about the emptiness of things, he studied and was in the Madhyamaka traditions, and I studied with him, not deeply, but I got enough from him to develop my own what I felt simpler inquiry to help me. Those were the living inquiries. So I owe my inspiration to Greg. But when I was working with him, we were talking about the emptiness of things and working with it. And he told me a story about how there was this organization that was devoted to helping people see that there's no self, the emptiness of the self. And he asked him, he said, well, what about the emptiness of everything else? And one of the guides said, well, what do you mean? There's no self, but like there's a university there, see, right down the road. And Greg said, well, in many forms of Buddhism, all things are empty, including the university. That's not just out there. That also is dependent on consciousness, the thoughts, feelings, sensations, awareness. Nothing independent there. Nothing that has a separate existence. But the point being is, when we don't do our embodiment work, this is my perspective on this, we get fixated on, is there a self or not? Is there a teacher or not? We get caught in that paradox that hasn't been embodied yet. There's no fucking teacher. There's no self. And there's a teacher and there's a self. And it's not something to pay attention to once you've seen it, because people are really suffering. We don't need to fixate on those things. Those are spiritual concepts. We've got work to do for the freedom that's available. I think we get lost in those things to stay safe, those conversations, you know. But and that's why I want to tell you about the 3 dimensions this way. I want to give you a disclaimer first, so that you can understand that when I go on YouTube, I'm going to be teaching differently. And let me say it this way. What I learned as a teacher and as a human being that investigated my experience, you know, the non-dual aspect of it, is that I didn't have a framework until after I woke up. And then I worked with Greg in different traditions and came to know Ken's work and understood the value of context and tradition and framework. And I'll explain it this way from a trauma perspective. If you don't have a context, then you have a context, but it's your default context, which is your unconscious programming running your spiritual path. So you're not being with what is, in other words. I mean, you are, but you're creating what you're being with. To stay safe and get love, we create suffering unconsciously from the level of repression, trauma. And so this is a really important piece of the awakening conversation, which I'll talk about on YouTube. But when we really see this, we go all the way. See, the trauma and repression conversation is tied directly to the awakening, because you get to see the emptiness of all things and embody that. If we use non-duality and different things to avoid the buried stuff, there's a bypass. And here's the bad news, which is what I want everyone to watch a video that I'm going to do before you watch my teaching on YouTube. On the playlist, there's going to be a video called Please Watch Before You Start the Free Teaching, or something like that in the playlist. I'll try to keep it 10 minutes or less. I'm going to pull up in Zoom the 3-dimensional map and show you that in the first and second dimension, which is what I'm doing on YouTube, and which is what the vast majority of teachings, traditions, therapies, and other awareness-based practices are doing, you cannot get to frozen fear in the body. You cannot access it, and that's the repression. So there's the bypass. It really doesn't have anything to do with any particular teacher or me or anyone, or it has to do with repression. And I'll explain it on the Zoom video for you on YouTube. But basically, the first and second dimension is what I call the conscious level, because the repression is buried deep. And if you don't understand that, I call that the unconsciousness, really. Because in first and second dimension practice, I'll show you, you're going to deal with ego identity, like they do in non-duality. Identity. There's a lot of focus on who am I, which we will focus on YouTube for sure. But you have to be careful there, because that identity comes from the emotions that we buried. Remember that whatever we have to hold back, what's true, that becomes a contraction in our body, and then we're forced to identify with what's false and grow up thinking that we are these identities, when we come to a non-dual teaching, we very innocently start exploring identity and wanting to be the awareness, of course, to which it all comes and goes, unconscious to the unconsciousness, the emotional repression, which is creating all that suffering. So there's an inherent issue with all of first and second dimension teachings and practices. This is why I didn't want to go on. This is why I didn't want to do any of that for about 8 years. One of the reasons that I became suicidal because of nerve pain was how the non-dual teachings had influenced my life. There's a danger that I don't know exactly what it is, because science won't study it. They study things like that you can diagnose, but they don't study like unprocessed emotion that drives a spiritual bypass. But if and when they do, I think they're going to find that the spiritual practices were developed by people who had repression. Ken Wilber's got the evidence for it, who were in anger or other repression, who produced spiritual practices which kept the repression buried, which actually were developed for that. But it was a very unconscious activity. And then it was passed on from generation to generation, from pointing to meditation, all of which is safe from the buried stuff. So this bypass is systemic and ongoing, historical, in my view. And if we don't say that from the beginning, then I just become a part of it unconsciously, and I won't do that. So I'm going to get on Zoom with you. I'm going to say, watch this before you start. And this is going to be most of the context will be there for you starting that you need. And then we're going to go right into experiential on YouTube. But that Zoom will not only explain the dimensions, it will highlight the bypass that is inescapable. I'll show you how it's inescapable, practically inescapable. There's a way out of it. But repression is driving suffering. Repression created a lot of spiritual practices. Repression drives identity. Repression drives it all. So our practices don't work. That's why there's so much bypassing. They don't work to get to that level. So I'm going to say that and explain it, and then I'm going to invite you there on YouTube to come and sit with me, and we'll talk about non-duality for sure. And the 3 dimensions are this. They're so simple. And if people understood why we create these concepts, it's so that you won't just go into a bypass when you're here. And if you hear this, you'll maybe understand why. How simple this is. The 3 dimensions are not linear, although one could have an experience of that, like you're in a dimension for a few years and then the next one and the next one. But it's all awareness. And so they're not real dimensions. This is all made up to point you to practice, basically to get to the root of suffering with our 3D work. But the first dimension is just awareness-based practice, teaching, method. Now that's like huge. I just named a ton of stuff that's included in that, from any kind of meditation basically what defines a first dimension practice is nothing is prompted up. So you don't feel into the body and ask a question, or you don't really do inquiry or anything like that, unless it's just be with what is and see everything coming and going to presence. If that's an inquiry, then that's first dimension. Whenever you don't prompt anything up, when you're just mindful to what's already here, that's first dimension. And you'll see why that's so important. I'm going to do that kind of pointing on YouTube. That's what a lot of non-duality teachers do. And you can't even come close to getting to frozen fear and emotional repression in those kinds of practices and pointers. But, as Ken Wilber said, he doesn't call it first dimension, that's my wording, but he says that these monks who they studied, these people who were exposed to Eastern practices, like me, definitely had deep states of realization through, which just means I'm the awareness. Awareness is what I am. And different degrees of embodiment of that, depending. But mostly just the recognition. See, but this is a big question, because the question of dissociation is in there. With all the trauma and repression, if you have a deep state of realization, that does not mean it's embodied. Although there can be a shift to presence for sure in that first dimension. But there's so much bypassing, because a lot of the monks and others and teachers don't go beyond that first dimension, which is just be with what is. And the repression remains buried. And so a lot of people, including me, look at all the teachers who are sick, chronic pain, the scandals, the monks who can't get to their shadows in meditation, as Ken says, or the monks who have repression and then get sick. Like, this is big. And it's because, a big part of it is because so many of the practices, which I think were developed by anger and other repressors in spirituality, in first dimension don't get to the repression. So we always have to be careful with it, that's all. But it's valuable. It has great benefits to sit and be. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to highlight. I'm going to spend most of my time not criticizing it. I'm not. You've heard me do it for 8 years. If you've been listening, there's a value and a benefit in it. It's just that I'm like the one who's sounding the alarm, because there's also a bypass in it. And then I'm going to do second dimension with you on YouTube. Second dimension is actually a development and inquiry in spiritual practice through the centuries, where people began to prompt things up. So both first and second dimension are what I call horizontal, just to orient you to your direct experience. So horizontal just means things come and go, one after the other. A thought comes, and then it goes. And then another thought comes, and then it goes. Or a feeling comes, one after the other, like you're looking at things in a series. For example, thought A comes up, falls thought B, and falls thought C, and falls into awareness. And then thought D says that they're all true, and I'm right. And then it falls away. But that's horizontal. All that happening to the awareness that you are, no matter what's arising. That's the horizontal teaching of first dimension. And then there's a horizontal practice or teaching of second dimension, which is, it's all the same thing in first dimension, because it's all awareness right here. But we just start prompting things up here in presence. So Byron Katie's work is second dimension. When she says, how do I react when I think that thought? Something gets prompted up that wouldn't otherwise arise to awareness because it's unconscious. And that gets closer to the emotional repression when you start prompting things up. But the problem is, the practices and inquiries that were developed in second dimension were developed with people who had repression, I think, including me, because the living inquiries are second dimension. And they don't get to the emotional repression either. It's not non-duality that you have to criticize. It's us humans who interpret and produce practices that lead people into a bypass away from the root of suffering that science has pointed out to us, but we are stubbornly ignorant of here in spirituality. And at the same time, there's such benefit in second dimension. And one of the reasons I want to come back is because, some people can't do our third dimension inquiry yet. They too are in a bypass. It's okay. Because here's one way I want to orient you to the way I'm going to teach. When I say bypass from now on, I want you to understand what I mean. It's not a bad thing. There's no energy around it for me. There may be for you. But what bypass really means is it's something going on unconsciously in people just because they had unconscious parents. They're staying safe and getting love by holding emotion back. That's completely buried. And it's in a contraction. So they don't know anything other than it's my body. And then stories come and shadows at the conscious level, what we may or may not be aware of, but they're more conscious than the repression. And that's our suffering. So you can see the problem with the dimensions. If you see that, which is if they don't get to that buried stuff, you're going to just sit there and watch things come and go horizontally. First dimension, perhaps endlessly. Who knows? Or second dimension, prompting things up and then just endlessly watching that. Because all of that comes from something that none of those practices and pointers can get to, which is the repression in third dimension. The practice that we do in third dimension, which will not be on YouTube for the reasons that I've explained. And so, okay, so those are the dimensions. The third dimension is this form of inquiry that actually goes into the buried, to the contraction, and brings into awareness the programming that holds the emotion back, so that the contraction in the body transmutes to presence. And that's the embodiment of presence, the 3D work. But what I've learned is not everybody is ready for that, or they've been programmed by teachers to believe that they shouldn't do that work first, or that embodiment is something that happens down the road. And my friends, I think that that context was created by people who had emotional repression, who just didn't get to their repression or shame until down the road, and they were teachers. And so I'm a teacher. I'm going to say, let's turn it inside out. If you're ready, some of you can just go to 3D work and get to the root of suffering. That's where I'm focused, if people are ready. And I come onto YouTube to teach, even though there's a bypass in those dimensions, because I see it differently now. And I want to spend the last segment just explaining not only what I think you're going to get if you come, but why I'm, well, some other things. Just stay tuned. You know, if you needed help with your sink and you invited a plumber over and they fixed the plumbing, and then they said, but I'm not really a plumber. Well, you say, I don't care. Just fix the plumbing. You know, that's a complex is what I'm saying. And when we do our deep work, I feel like I can just step into the role of teacher without second guessing it, but not identified with it. And that's why I feel like teaching now. And I also know that people are in different places with regard to those dimensions. And some people aren't even on that dimensional map because they don't know about awareness-based practice or realization. So they're out there in the world, you know, whether they're on social media talking about narcissists, which we're trying to catch them because there's your suffering, there's the repression, or gaslighting, there's your repression. Or they're just suffering. And at best, they may know about meditation, but not non-duality. And so I even want to reach those people because I know something that I didn't know. Much more now as to why people come to non-duality teachings, which is to regulate their nervous system. And I'm going to do that too. I'm going to show you how to do that in my own way, including through inquiry, but other ways on YouTube. And sometimes that's just what people need, because if they can't sort of calm their system down enough to start noticing present moment awareness, they can't begin any sort of non-dual investigation or anything like that. And some wouldn't even be interested. But what I say to people is, I think when it comes to real healing, no matter what you're suffering from out there, it's still emotional repression. And you're going to look for answers for that at the conscious level, but it's all buried. And that's what people are doing, whether they go to spiritual seeking or drugs or whatever else. That's the trauma running it. And all we're doing here is calling it all out and saying all of those things are resources until you get to the root of suffering. In other words, we're just staying safe and getting love and managing safety through these different things until we end suffering, which is the third dimension work. But our systems are just fighting that, right? Kicking and screaming. And it was easier, frankly, as a first dimension teacher, not only to make money because people flock to the word enlightenment or awakening, but because their nervous system, because of their suffering, they're seeking safety, even if only unconsciously, even if only temporarily. I mean, people want quietness and calmness irrevocably, but when you have trauma and repression running things, you can't have that. It's just usually a temporary reprieve or a shift to presence that isn't embodied. And so, you know, like the teacher who has the chronic pain or the disease, the suffering continues until you get to the root of suffering. That's why I say, those who are ready, just go into our mentorship program in 3D and let me show you how to end the suffering. It's a skillful practice. But not everybody's ready and their nervous systems aren't. I mean, some people, my own husband or partner has trouble sitting sometimes quietly because of the trauma of his childhood. And therefore trouble with inquiry. So living with him has taught me that there's such benefit to these teachings just on the level of nervous system regulation and hope for people who are suffering, because I feel like I can bring those people into a deeper conversation about, why are you suffering? Where's that coming from? And do you want to get to the root of it, or do you just want to manage that and regulate your system? Well, I'm going to show you how to do that, but I'm also going to show you how seeking safety or regulating your system is the bypass, because the very need for seeking safety comes from the emotions that we buried and this frozen fear, the trauma. So you keep regulating, keep missing the repression, see? But I'm going to show you how to regulate the system and rest as awareness and let things be as they are. These things are already as they are. That's seeing things coming and going to awareness. But we're going to talk about how that, at times, we're going to talk about this on YouTube, that and nervous system regulation is the bypass. The pointing is the bypass, created by people who had repression, passed down from generations. The second dimension inquiry, as beautiful as it is, and people have had deep states of realization and embodiment in second dimension work, or just relief from suffering, but there's a bypass. And if you can handle a teacher who teaches in those dimensions, but fully reflects and criticizes that teaching, sometimes at the end of a meditation or an inquiry, or reflects back at the bypass throughout without interrupting you, just a lot of quietness and pointing, but then coming to discussion, for example, for just a few minutes about the bypass in that, and then going back to that practice and seeing it differently, and then becoming more open to seeing, oh, so I'm doing this with Scott. I'm actually here on YouTube to avoid my emotions. I want to show you that. I came to non-duality because I have repression. I'm going to show you that too. And then when I show you that, we're going to go back to pointing to awareness, and I'm going to show you that recognition and why that's important as the ground of what you are, so that you can hold all the parts that are buried. Because the ego, no wonder people question that. That's not what we are. But that's produced by the repression, the frozen fear to keep you safe, get you love. So we're not going to focus there. We're going to do a little bit of inquiry on identity, but mostly to show you how to do it, and then to show you where that comes from. And that also comes from that stuff that's buried. And then through this, you'll see that this really is a non-dual teaching. It's showing you what you are through direct experience. And if you take it all the way, it's the embodiment of that. But people are in different places with that. See, so on a particular Sunday night, I might just have a meditation, just being, pointing to what you are. And then on the next Sunday night, I might do inquiry with you in second dimension and show you, for example, how to question your spiritual beliefs. Just let go of them, so you're just more grounded in awareness through inquiry, questioning. Or showing you how shadows come up to distract you from what you've buried, and they create suffering, and simple techniques to own those shadows, and then not only relieve that suffering in the moment, but see where the shadow is coming from, the emotional repression. We're going to be with what is. We're going to do a lot of being with what is, and just grounding ourselves in the presence that is already here. We don't ground ourselves. We recognize that this is already possible if we just turn and look from it. And I'm going to show you how being with what is being produced. The stuff that we're experiencing is being produced by the unconscious repression and trauma, and that's how we're staying safe from what's buried also. And I'll point you to how that bypass happens too. It's interesting because when I was a seeker, I never found a teacher who would point and then show the blind spots of the pointing, or sit with you and then show you how hidden in the silence is the trauma that you're hiding by making the silence or stillness important. So that's the kind of teacher I want to be. See, that feels good. To do it the old way doesn't feel good. I didn't do it. I can't do that and not explain the inherent bypass in those dimensions, I think, created by people who had repression. So stay tuned, just a few more minutes. I'm going to try to hit my hour and a half mark. I have so many reasons why I will not do, and we will not do, any of the trainers 3D inquiry publicly. And it's not for the reason that you think, because someone said, well, why don't you just give it away? And then people would just come. They would flock to you because you have a completely different way. But it's not that easy. It's not just about, getting popular or helping people, just getting it out there. I did that, and a few things happened. Let me tell you about this work if you haven't done it. You have to be skillful, which means it's a simple skill, but it's about becoming conscious of the unconscious. So that's a mentorship, because we are already bypassing just by being human, because our unconscious system just wants us to stay safe and get love. That's the buried emotions that you have no consciousness of, and that's running you. The unconsciousness will run you until you make it conscious. It'll run your life. And it does. And it runs your spiritual practice. So I have to meet people on YouTube, you guys, whomever, who don't yet know and have not made conscious the fact that their unconsciousness is driving a bypass. And I have to meet them where they are, because they can't help that. There's an unconsciousness there. So I have to help them with first and second dimension pointing and skills so that they can see, I'm going to actually be your teacher. I'm going to show you how to journal even, because it's so important to see that some of the stuff that's creating suffering, you don't even know. It's there. I'm going to show you how to find it. And that's a key to ending suffering. They're on YouTube. I'm going to show you that. But in third dimension, this is very deep inquiry, guys. And it takes a container. We work with people who are avoidant attachment, for example, who just disconnect from us because their trauma just sabotages their practice. Or people who are very anxious attachment, who are there on us all the time. And we have to work with them. This is trauma. And they're doing spiritual practice. And we work at every level, all the way down to the unconscious. That's not something that you do publicly. You need a safe container. You need people who feel safe. There are trollers and others on social media who don't make people feel safe with regard to emotions that are repressed. It needs to be a safe container with skills and context, and we do it quite well. I'll tell you, we've gotten so much better at that. But that's just not where everyone is. I'll tell you this. If you already know that you're bypassing, if you already understand even, without being conscious of it, that at the unconscious level, you're driven by programming to stay safe by holding emotions back, frozen fear, anger, hurt, sadness, and to get love and approval by holding those back, and that's science, and that's the root of most of, or much, if not all, of your suffering. You're already ready for 3D. Why are you wasting any time? I'm already giving it away for YouTube. Don't spend any more money if you know you're bypassing, because we can correct that. That's 3D inquiry. And that's as simple as going to just get on our newsletter, and we'll send you resources for mentorship. Repressiontest.com is how you take our repression test and get on the newsletter. And I'll put the link to that in the description too. Or you just go to Kilby.com. There's on the top, it says Mentorship Discovery Kit. And it's one session with one of us 5 trainers. We'll show you the 3D work. We'll get you going. And then there'll be a week of mentorship after that to support you. And then there you are. To begin that 3D work. And that's just for people who know that they're ready, who know that they're in a bypass, who already know that non-duality contains a bypass, who are probably still suffering, see, even after they've been exposed. It could be, to these teachings, could be addiction, depression, chronic pain, disease, suffering, deficiency stories, lack, still, shame, anything, mental health, and they just haven't linked it up. That the first and second dimension practices and teachings don't get to the root of suffering. If you're ready, go to the Mentorship Discovery Kit at the very top of Kiloby.com. But we already know that that's a certain percentage of people. And then as a teacher, I look at the world now, or social media, as my satsang or my playground, because there's so many more of you out there who could benefit from. I've written 7 books on non-dual realization. I want to talk to people who have interest in that. The fact that we found a bypass in it doesn't make those non-dual traditions worthless. The reason I'm not charging is because I don't want to lead people into a bypass. And if you stay in those dimensions, you're in a bypass. But there's some rich benefit there, especially if you become aware of the bypass and how to see it all. And I'll show it to you. This feels like the beginning of my teaching. It feels like this is what it would feel like to be a non-dual teacher, because of the embodiment is there. And now I can see the path, and I can see people at different places, and at least this path, right? It's the only one I have to know. And I can go in the first dimension meditation and just meet people there. Maybe even people who just saw us on Instagram and they're anxious, and they come, and I'm going to show you how to regulate that and be with what is there, and maybe even some inquiry on that, and show you where it comes from. And we're going to talk about who are you, what are you, and get right down to the question of identity on YouTube. And that meets more people, see? Because to be honest with you, I didn't start the path in 3D. I had to bypass the shit out of everything, keep suffering, then develop 3D with Dan. But we've turned it inside out. We're saying, like, if you're ready, it's here. See, part of the programming of people creating teachings is that teachers say, well, if there's some embodiment process or maybe shame, yeah, you'll get to that. That's one of the last layers and all that. That's the people who have repression creating those teachings and context. You don't have to wait to get to shame. You don't have to wait till the end of your spiritual path to get to the root of suffering. Think about that. That's somebody who's bypassing, who has repression, and who finally discovered it at the end, just like I did, right? But if we're teachers, we ought to turn around and say, that's not something that you hide or you stay safe from. The root of suffering, you're whole. You deal with that in the beginning. But a lot of those teachers, and like me, I didn't know how to deal with it. Because when you awaken to what you are, shit happens. Look at how sick we get, teachers, many of us, or the chronic pain. And even if you did know that came because you missed the root of suffering, then what would you do about it? And so there's shame with it among teachers too, but they can't talk about that. Even if they make some connection, because teachers are smart, they know. What are you going to do about it? Because you can't get to the trauma and repression in first and second dimension teachings, and that's where they teach. That's why I'm coming out as a teacher, so that you don't have to just have that as your choices. You also don't have to have as your choices teachers who don't answer questions like anything, because everything is relevant. Everything comes up for a reason. The trauma's producing it. So there's no such thing as those are just your stories. I'm not going to gaslight you like that, we're going to use your stories to get to the root of suffering. If you don't want to do that, I'm going to remind you, well, maybe you're not ready to like wake up to what you are, for example, or get to the root of that story. That's fine. But I think as a teacher, you would want me to point that out. Because I wanted my best teachers always pointed things out very directly without mincing words. The ones that I had after the awakening, the ones that I trusted more. Because they talked about embodiment. And we'll be sitting in silence too. Because the silence goes deep for me now. It's like energetic silence. Deep, quiet, but energy infused within it. It almost reminds me of like when they say that space isn't really empty. They're so right. I mean, I think many people are looking for that sort of empty, which is like void, very disembodied realization. But this is aliveness, fully and relational, embodied realization, because that's where our suffering is. In the body, in relationship. Trauma is hidden there and revealed in relationship. As they say, who was that said that? I should give credit, one of the trauma researchers. The quietness will be our friend. It's not, I don't want to say it's what you are, because our repression hides in that. But the quietness will give us reprieve. Just the stillness with each other when we sit together on YouTube will give us not only reprieve for a moment from our daily suffering, but a moment to notice being aware. And from there, we can really explore the nature of reality, including all your relationships and your diseases. Eventually, when you're ready, we're talking about ending suffering. You're going to go, but kicking and screaming, because that's what repression does. It's what trauma does. It tries to keep you safe and get you love. Okay, so I want to leave you with this, and I just, for some reason, want to say this. Someone said, Scott, it's interesting the approach you take. You show us that our conditioning is driving us into a bypass because we're just trying to survive as separate selves. And our conditioning of the trauma is stay safe, get love. But you bring in science to help defeat our very powerful belief systems. I said, yes. I just put a heart there, like, yeah, I agree. That's what I'm doing. I don't think about it that way. I mean, I do, but it's not really a belief system that I'm putting forth here. I'm saying this is inquiry, and science is in their own kind of inquiry. It might not be spiritual inquiry, and you go deeper into the nature of direct experience and awareness as awareness. But to ignore the findings of science, I think is just, it's exactly how the bypass happens. It's just to bury your head in the sand. As to those findings, that's Ken's work. He says, when we move beyond the scientific rational stage of development, we have to include it. We don't, what's the word he uses? We don't shun it. We don't exclude it. It's included. There you go. It's transcended and included, he says. And so when we're bypassing, we have repression, we don't include it because it's showing us something we don't want to see. This is our own bodies, and it's showing us, science is, that in our bodies, we have the driver of suffering. And it's showing us that in so many ways. We're so blind to it in spirituality, many of us. So quantum physics, although science and non-duality is onto that topic of how quantum physics is showing us, and non-duality are just merged now, because in non-duality it's direct experience of no separation, and then science is studying so many aspects of consciousness and, interesting new things that are connected and having insights that are very similar to the traditions. That's the science connection which needs to be made. And then there's Carl Jung and Freud, who discovered or talked about the true unconscious, the shadows, the emotional repression. That's a Western scientific discovery. Then you've got the trauma research. And the last however many decades, a lot of it, again, that's Western science trying to help us here in the Eastern practice and teachings. But how much are we listening? And then you've got someone like Donald Hoffman. Well, first of all, you also have postmodern philosophy over here, which is deconstructing the idea of any objective reality. Quantum physics, deconstructing the idea of any objective reality, non-duality, no objective reality. Everywhere you turn. And then science, someone like Donald Hoffman, who has studied evolutionary, just evolution. They've done studies on this. And just go listen to him. Here's a butchered way of saying it. They've studied, and basically, in terms of evolution and what we're experiencing as beings, we're never experiencing reality as it is. We're only, as we know here in non-duality, experiencing our conditioning. And what they call it in that research, evolutionary research, is that we're only experiencing fitness payoffs. Look up Donald Hoffman on YouTube. Fitness payoffs. So he's a scientist, and he's trying to tell us this from a scientific objective viewpoint, and we should listen. But from a first-person awareness perspective, this is fascinating. And this is KI here, because what they call fitness payoffs, we've discovered as utilities with regard to the emotional system, meaning we've discovered the conditioning of the fitness payoffs here in KI, because we're discovering the deep unconscious conditioning of staying safe and getting love. Those are what we call the utilities. I'll show you that on YouTube, how that's embedded in our bodies and running everything. And so evolutionary research is over here saying basically that there's no objective reality. That's what we're saying. This repression, this conditioning is creating that, and it's creating that for us to stay safe and get love. But in the evolutionary world, they say that it's to survive and procreate. And that's so interesting, because that sounds like a scientific view, headier than direct experience, right? Because in direct experience, it's actually more like not survive and procreate. Children who are traumatized or hold their emotions back don't think about those things. Their nervous system just takes care of them. And the most that we can know from direct experience buried in the body is, I have to stay safe and get love. And that's direct experience that you'll see here, especially third dimension, mostly third dimension, actually, inquiry. But this is, in my view, survive and procreate. It's the programming that runs the separate self, just like they're saying the survival, the evolution of this separate self, which is stay safe, means survive. And get love means, well, eventually, get love and have babies, procreate. And so that's embedded within us, and we have to honor and respect that. That's science will, I think, further tell us more about that as we go. Our bodies tell us everything we want to know about that. If we're open, that's third dimension inquiry. But until then, we're just kind of bypassing what science is saying and what we're saying over here in KI. And that's part of the teaching on YouTube. On certain times, you'll pull up and I'll say these things, and I'll say, look, we've got to go big here and include all these, transcend, but include these perspectives that are trying to tell us something about our bypass over here and our unconsciousness and spirituality. And I don't want to have that unconsciousness in the teaching that I do on YouTube. So I invite you all there. I'm keeping to my word, an hour and 15 minutes here. As always, if you haven't started the path, our work, make no mistake about it, Dan and me, is 3D repression inquiry. That's where you get to the bypass and you can end suffering, period. That is our work. Make no mistake. What I'm about to do on YouTube is not really our work. It's just part of it. It's like the way that we nurture people into ending suffering. I'm going to go on YouTube. I'm going to point to presence. Presence is the foundation of our experience. We can't even open to the parts that we've buried without the presence. Because the ego identity that's created from the repression can't hold everything. It's created by the repression. Hear that? And so only what you really are can allow everything, including what's buried. That's third dimension. There's the root of your suffering. But so the teaching of this work is this podcast, again, and the 3D work. What I'm about to do on YouTube is more like a nurturing process for people, because KI actually includes all these dimensions. You may not know that, but I mean, we focus on third dimension because it works so well. I'm focusing on first and second dimension because there are people who don't know how well 3D works. And also, and I want to show them, we have mentorship programs for that. That's how I make my living as a teacher. I have no problem telling you that. I won't charge for the first and second dimension. I will for the third dimension because that's some good stuff and it should be charged for. You value that. That's good. And so is the first and second dimension. That's a nurturing process for people who don't even know about meditation, who don't know about awakening, who don't know that there's a bypass in awakening teachings, who don't know what the bypass is, who don't know how to find it, and who come here eventually to end suffering because we found it. If you want to get started on the 3D work, as always, as recommended, that's where I would go if you're ready. Take our repression test either at repressiontest.com or the link in my description there for this episode. And if you're not ready for that, join me on YouTube. I mean, because I'm going to have fun and I'm loving this. Like, this is my playground. Social media is the satsang. We're at retreat now and it never ends. You can ask me questions in the comments of YouTube. It's like being at Teach. I'm going to answer. I'm going to show you how to do inquiry the best I can. I can't talk to everyone. And so the people that I mentor are the people that I focus mostly on. And I just will answer questions publicly as best I can. But I consider the whole teaching to be kind of public and on social media now. And now you know where to go to get what you want. Thank you for listening.